Welcome to Bible study. Today I want to talk with you a little bit about the Psalter and reading the Psalms and what to expect in them a little bit, and give you some tips and some helps for reading the Psalms, because we're going to be looking at these marvelous documents in conjunction with the Deuteronomic history and the life and the story of King David. And then we're going to go in and we're going to read what he wrote. And as he reflected on these events and as he talked to God about himself, that's going to give us a interior view, if you will, of the events that we get almost nowhere else in the Bible. I mean, we have many occasions where we hear of the words and the deeds of people, but with these Psalms, we get to live in the heart of the person who's actually experiencing these things. And I think that's really exciting and really good. Let's talk a little bit about Psalms and just reading them. The Psalter is an amazing book. It has been the hymnal of God's people for 3,000 years. That's why I'm standing up here in front of the organ today as I talk to you, because it is intricately tied with music and emotion and the worship of God's people. It is truly an amazing body of literature. I mean, I don't know how many times I've walked into a faithful Christian's home and discovered there a copy of the 23rd Psalm, embroidered on a plaque, on a plate, somewhere on the wall in that house. These words continue to speak to everyday people. And you think about that. That's 3,000-year-old literature. David lived 1,000 years before Jesus. He was old when Jesus was born. And that's almost unheard of. Nobody uses literature that old. All right? Yes, there are people who read older documents, things like the Gilgamesh epic or something like the Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Those are still read, and sometimes students do that in school, but nobody puts that on their wall. Nobody thinks about those things and says, that's going to guide my life. That's going to bring me hope and meaning. But the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Those words resonate in a way with people to this very day. I mean, I've written a lot of things. I can't imagine anybody is going to be reading anything that I've written, 12 months after I've died. We're still reading David 3,000 years later. That's amazing. But we live in a prose age, and that means we have to take a little bit of time and think a little bit about what we're doing. When I say we live in a prose age, we live in a time when we primarily get our information in written form through prose, textbooks, newspapers, magazines, blogs, things like that. That really only came about with the advent of printing presses and modern technologies that have allowed us to reproduce materials very cheaply, very, very rapidly. And that's had a certain effect on the way that we read. I mean, my students, myself, when I was in school, we had to master the art of skimming, because we had so much material we were expected to read and to master. And so we learned how to read very quickly, and we learned how to sort of skim across a page, pick up the essential, the salient points that we needed to have, and get on to the next page, because I had 100 more pages to do. I never had the time to slow down and think about what I was reading. I think that's a bad way to educate people. And it's not the way you can read the Psalms. If you took 20 minutes to read a 10-verse psalm, that could be about right. Maybe even not enough. My first admonition to you as a reader of the Psalms, as somebody who wants to experience these words of David, is slow down. Don't set yourself a goal of getting to the end. Rather, set yourself a goal of dwelling in and experiencing and really listening to what this has to say. That's where this reading will be rewarding for you. Also, you need to come to poetry with a little bit of a different expectation. For many, many years now, we've really experienced things through prose, and we've tended to say that poems are really talking about emotional, aesthetic, beauty, those sorts of things. But prior to the printing press and prior to this avalanche of prose literature that we have, if you wanted to get out a really serious idea, if you wanted to say something really important, oftentimes you said it in poetry. There's a number of reasons for that, and one of them is that poems are just easier to remember. Most people couldn't read. If you said it in a poem, they could learn it faster and learn it more accurately and remember it more accurately. The other reason is that because printing and the production of written material was so frightfully expensive, the vellum of medieval manuscript oftentimes was worth as much as gold. It weighed pound for pound. You had to be very dense in your language, very concise. And poetry has a way of doing that in ways that prose just doesn't. You can be much more economical with your words that way. It takes a lot of work, but it's rewarded by having a very clear, concise, and quick, if you will, or short summary of what you're trying to say. So very important philosophical, moral ideas that we would normally experience in prose in the ancient world were going to be communicated in poetry. The prophets spoke most of their oracles in poems. So much of Isaiah, Jeremiah, places like that are really poems. But even something, like a major epic story like the Iliad and the Odyssey or Gilgamesh or something like that, those are actually all written in meters and in rhyme forms and in having all the hallmarks of poetry. So come to this expecting a little more than you do from a modern poem. Because modern poetry is largely said, okay, if you want to talk about science, big ideas, history, morals, those kinds of things, you're pretty much going to do that in a prose format. Not in the ancient world. They put a lot more into poetry than we do today. So let's talk a little bit about how to read it. Poetry usually makes use of a number of literary devices. In English, we're used to rhyme, we're used to meter, we might be used to archaic words, things like that. Hebrew poetry is a little different. We cannot discern any meter in Hebrew poetry. And rhyming just wasn't a thing for them. Just wasn't a big deal. They did like archaic words, and they sometimes liked funny words. They really liked puns. And so words that sound alike in Hebrew will sometimes show up. For instance, in the prophet Amos, one time God says, "What do you see, Amos?" Amos replies, "I see a basket of summer figs." And God goes, "That's right, destruction." Well, that's because the word for basket and the word for destruction in Hebrew sound very similar to each other. And that whole exchange, by the way, is conducted in poetry. The one structure, however, puns don't translate. They don't work from language to language. You're going to need to use the footnotes in your Bible to be able to pick out any of those puns. And there's not a lot of them in the Psalter. They actually occur more in the prophetic poems and in the oracular literature like that. The one that is everywhere in the Psalter, though, and that we really want to spend some time with, is the idea of parallels. This is the basic structure of Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poets love to put two things side by side. Compare them, look at them side by side, notice the similarities, notice the differences, and really ask you as a reader, hearer of this poem, to pull meaning out of that. This is one of the primary vehicles for the intellectual engagement of one of these poems. So let's look at one of these and do it and kind of show you how it works. If you haven't got your Bible handy, shut the video off, go get it. When you get it, come back and open it up to Psalm number 1. So Psalm number 1, the very first one. Probably the introduction to the whole book of Psalms. It's going to tell us this is what's in here. It's also, however, I think almost kind of a key to unlocking the parallels that are inside the text. Psalm 1, verse 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Don't just blow on to the next verse. Stop. Ask yourself, what is being compared here? We have actually in this verse 3 comparisons going on, don't we? The blessed is the man who doesn't walk, doesn't stand, doesn't sit. Now, when you see a parallel, there's really 3 choices for how they work. Sometimes you're comparing 2 opposite things. The wise man does this, the foolish man does that. Sometimes you're comparing 2 things that are very, very similar to each other, and you're really reinforcing, okay? So that the 2 things are really saying exactly the same thing. But sometimes you see kind of a motion or a development or a growth going on inside this. Some kind of movement is happening, and I think that's what's going on with this one. Blessed is the man. So this is the blessed man. He isn't walking, standing, or sitting. You should be thinking now, what's going on here? What's the difference between walking, standing, and sitting? It could well be that this is a comparison of engagement. That, for instance, the person who is walking in the counsel of the wicked is far more engaged in doing the evil thing. The one who is standing is not so engaged. And the one who is sitting is even more disengaged from it, is much more passive. It could, however, actually almost be the opposite of that. If you think about in terms of a royal courtroom where the king is sitting with all of his counselors and servants, it's the servants who are walking around. It's his advisors, his counselors who are standing, but it's the king, the one who has the ultimate authority and responsibility for what's going on, who is sitting. So, I mean, this parallel could be ascending a role of authority, or it could be descending the idea of engagement and activity. Are they both right? Well, maybe in a sense. But what you get to do now is figure out, how am I reading this? How am I hearing this? The genre of poetry oftentimes puts a great deal of responsibility on you as a reader to sometimes say, well, this is what I think it means. Go on to verse 2. Now we get a comparison of the blessed man in the positive sense. What is this blessed man? This blessed man delights in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. You might first notice there's another little structure in here. Notice it goes, he delights in the law, on the law he meditates. You notice you get kind of a reverse going between subject and verb, and they flip. But probably what you want to focus on more here is, what's the difference between delighting and meditating? When I think about delighting in something, I think about, this is what's coming up from inside of me. These are my affectations, my emotions, my desires, what I like. I like the law of God. I delight in it. It makes me happy. Meditation, on the other hand, meditation is a discipline. Meditation is something I do. Meditation is something I focus on. They're both very interior, but there's one of them is drawing me, and one of them I'm working toward. So the law of God is both drawing me in, and the law of God is something I meditate on, something I strive for, I work toward, I think about. And I need to practice meditation. Delight is something that is far more spontaneous. Now we get a description of this blessed man. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. He is like a tree planted by streams of water. And then we get another parallel, don't we? Yields his fruit in season, his leaf does not wither. These are two of the same things. This is kind of a parallel that is reinforcing, doesn't it? But they're also saying something. This may be a little bit developmental too. He yields his fruit in season. This sort of blessedness is something that brings forth something. But his leaf does not wither. That is talking about stress, isn't it? That the withering of a leaf is going to happen in the heat of summer. And his leaf does not wither. He's like a tree planted by a stream of water. He has this constant source of life. And so that means he's both fruitful and he is persistent, durable. He perseveres in difficult times. He sums that all up with, in all that he does, he prospers. This, then, little parallel is laid in parallel to something else. And so you can get parallels in parallels. This parallel describes the blessed man. The wicked man is now going to be done in another parallel, and that'll be contrasted with the blessed man. Not so the wicked. They are like the chaff that the wind blows away. Notice the comparison between that and the tree planted by the water. The chaff is that detritus of the wheat stubble that happens after you harvest your wheat. You take the grains of wheat, you gather them carefully, you put them in some sort of storage, you make your flour and your bread and all those things out of it. But the chaff, it's trash. It blows away. And in fact, that's how they separated it in the ancient world. They would they'd get a smooth area without any dirt or anything in it, and they would take that wheat and they would beat it with a flail, and then they would take a fork and they'd throw it up in the air. And the wind would take the chaff, which was lighter, and blow it away, and the grain would all fall to the ground. That's how they would separate those two things. So the blessed man is the thing you save, all right? He is fruitful, he's persevered, he's like a tree, he's stable and solid. The wicked man, he's like that chaff that just blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. Again, notice the parallel. What's being compared? Well, the wicked and the sinners are pretty similar, aren't they? But notice what now is being compared is where they stand. They don't stand in the judgment. That means when the judge judges, they fall. The judgment falls against them. But also, they're not standing in the congregation of the righteous. They don't belong there. They aren't among the blessed people of God. Those are two different places, aren't they? One is much more personal, individual. You are judged by the judge individually. The other one is, who are your people? Who are your friends? But then this last one, look at verse 6. Now we're at the end of the psalm. This is really critical. And this is why you want to pay really close attention. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Notice at the beginning we started with, blessed is the man, not so the wicked fellow. But notice what's actually compared here. It's not the man. It's not the blessed man or the wicked man. The way. The way of the righteous man is known by the Lord. The Lord sees it, he knows it, and I think approves of it. But the way of the wicked will perish. Notice it doesn't say the wicked. It doesn't say the wicked man perishes, it says his way perishes. A word of grace, a bit of hope. Is the wicked man given to have the gift of forgiveness and life? His way is what? Deceit and greed and self-serving and all kinds of the wickedness of his life. All of those, the counsels and the ways of the sinners and the seat of the scoffers, that's all going to go away. But is the creation of God, even though it is a wicked man, is that also something that will be saved? Not his way, but the person himself. What an interesting question. What does that psalm actually ask us to think about? If you just blow through it, you're not going to pick up on this, that, at the end, it's not the man or the blessed or the wicked man that's, no, it's their way that is compared. And you would totally miss that. So, over the course of this study, we're going to assign a number of psalms for you to read. It's going to be very helpful if you read them before you come to class, if you can, and that you read them slowly. I pray this is a blessing to you, as it will be a blessing to me, and that you enjoy your time with us very much. Have fun reading the Psalms. Bye-bye.